Hello. First of all, thank you, Platform and Made, for inviting me to this event and allowing me to present our project. My name is Steyn. I'm founder of Steyn Studio. We are based in London, although we work in South Africa and Spain as well, primarily because that's where life has taken me. I was born here, which is about 2 hours away from here, which is where I studied, and about 1 hour away from here, which is where the project site is located. At Steyn Studio, we like nature. We are inspired by it. We like to invite it into our buildings and projects, and bringing man and nature a little bit closer together. These are just a few of the examples. The Garden Cafe project was finished towards the end of last year with the great help of our colleagues in South Africa, which included Meyer and Associates, Square One Landscape Architects, and also GVK Sizazama, who built the project. And of course, for projects like these, as architects, to achieve these things, you need great clients. And in our case, the client for this was the Bosch's estate. The site itself is located within the Breda River Valley, which is a wine region in South Africa. It's a fertile valley which is, has got this majestic mountains on either side of it. It's nicknamed Little Switzerland in South Africa because of the mountains. And it's a landscape that was once inhabited by the San nomadic tribes, and then later the Dutch settlers arrived as well. And apparently, the Dutch settlers were quite inspired by the structures, the huts of the San people. On the left, you can see an image of a typical Maikis hut. Translated, it means mat house, because the structure would be covered over with reed mats. And on the right are a few examples of the pioneer houses from the settlers. We were originally involved with the project in 2016, around about there. We completed it then. And what we did at the first phase of the project was basically create a micro version of what happens in the valley at a bigger scale. Having the mountains either side of the valley and then the valley in between the two. So we created, and one part, on one side of the estate, you have the existing Cape Dutch farm. You've got the vineyards in between, and then on the other side, we actually created a mountain. This is the existing manor house, which is protected by heritage. You can see its elaborate gable, which is Baroque inspired, which has a strong relationship to the mountains in the background. And opposite this, on the other side of the estate, we did this, which some of you might know. It's the Bosch's Chapel. A year or so after this was finished, the client came back to us and he said, we've got a problem. The chapel has become too popular and the estate is booked out every weekend. In other words, the general public, no one can come to it because it's always booked out with private events. So essentially, what he wanted to do was to create a new space to allow private functions to happen together with other functions as well, you know, so that the place can be enjoyed throughout. So the idea was to fertilize the valley which we created between these two mountains, the manor house and the chapel, by means of inserting a new garden. And then inside the garden, to put a new building in the form of a cafe and a shop. The client was also adamant that it should be quite discreet, and he didn't want any views to be spoiled to this and also to the manor house. So, because it was quite a important thing, the landscape, we decided to do a mini competition. And from the competition, we selected Square One landscape architects based on the strength of their concept, which basically involved splitting up this newly created valley landscape into 3 terraces, each terrace with its own individual identity, and then having rooms carved out of the landscape. And we also liked it because there were some ideas that resonated with some of ours. Such as this space here in the foreground is a tea garden, which was partially sunken into the ground, and that had some benefits in terms of visual impact, but also it's quite a windy area, so it acted as a windshield. And also what's quite nice about the space, when you are inside it, it kind of purifies the view around, and it makes the mountains more obvious. So we worked with Square One to further develop the master plan. As the brief grew, the building became bigger and bigger to about 750 square meters, which is still a modest in size, but a little bit too big to comfortably hide it within the landscape. So we convinced the client to split it into 2 smaller buildings, one being the Garden Cafe, which is to the south, where that number 5 is, and the shop, which is further up. So we created 2 points of interest, 2 nodes within that landscape. The buildings are mostly dug into the ground, and we like to see it with only the public spaces being visible to the public, and the public spaces being more celebrated than the rest. So on this image, you can see the chapel in the foreground, the manor house opposite that, so the axis is still quite strong and maintained. And then the new intervention is to the right of that, and you can just about make it out if you squint, which is a good thing. It means that we've done our job, at least, in hiding them. This is a view looking in the opposite direction, with a chapel in the distance. And you can just about see the 2 new buildings in the foreground, sunken in. Yeah, we like to see them as jewels in the landscape. Most of the building is underground. All the servicing elements are underground, with the public front of house spaces being more celebrated and to the outside. It's got a big open area outside, which is multifunctional, which is used for events, such as markets or music performances. We copied a lot of the materials from the chapel because we wanted to create a sense of place, create a family of buildings that share some kind of relation, but obviously with the chapel still being the star of the show. And obviously the 2 most interesting parts of the project is the timber trellis and the glass facade. And that's why we decided whatever we do inside, we need to sort of pull back from the structure and that glass facade. So we concentrated all the lighting requirements into the middle of the space, through this suspended triangular halo. And the deli counter has got all the display elements, display space below that as well. Air conditioning is fed through the edges of the space at the bottom of the floor. Again, as said, we were partly influenced by these structures, which were later to enclose them. They had these grass mats thrown over them. And we thought it could be nice if the building would start to do something similar. So the landscape's quite young at the moment, so the idea is that in time it would kind of consume the building. This is some conceptual model development. The very first image was a model we did before, just a quick model, before we got Square One involved. But it already illustrated the principle of digging the building into the ground and creating this public space in front of it. And later on, the rest are as it developed with Square One landscape architects, trying to integrate it into the landscape. And in those, you can just see that structural tellers becoming apparent. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. It started to extend in the landscape, wrapping around that outside space, and in a way strengthening that idea of pulling the landscape into the building. We initially thought of using laminated timber sections and joining that with metal connectors. But after we started talking to the engineers, it became quite a complicated thing because all the members meet at different angles. And also, it didn't quite lend itself to that idea, that initial idea of the slats of the huts and the bendiness of it. So we went back and we played around a bit more with physical models and digital models, and doing research. And then we came across Frei Otto's Mannheim sports hall, and we thought, voila, it's kind of what we want. We like the weaved nature of it and the elegance of it. So went back to our Rhino guys. They used Grasshopper, spoke to the engineers, did some parametrics in order to find the right shape. And as you can see on this initial render, how that weaved structure started to come together. We went to Arup to help us with the specification of the timber. We initially wanted to use larch, but they pointed us towards American white oak, primarily because of the short radiuses we need, the bendability of the wood, and also the durability of the wood. And it's also quite resistant against rot and insects. So just to make sure that the theory and the practice comes together, we had a part of the structure made to 1:1 scale as a mock-up. What they actually found out was because of the short radii in the building, they couldn't actually bend it as much as they wanted to naturally. So they had to steam bend it in the workshop. And they used a concoction of PVC pipes into which they inserted the slats, and then they pumped steam at a very high temperature in there, and they bent it. I think it's probably something they saw on YouTube or something, but at least it worked. Installing it was also complicated. We resurveyed the whole structure after it was built. We had to adjust some of the coordinates, and then each one of these coordinates were then plotted back onto the soffit of the structure. And basically then it was a matter of connecting the dots after that. And some we even adjusted by eye. So we became so obsessed with the structure that we completely forgot about the glass facade. Um, partly intentional because we wanted to keep that idea of inside and outside. So I think we kind of intentionally just didn't draw it because we didn't want anything to spoil that connection between the two. We went to Arab again, and anyway, we wanted to avoid that, where the structure is cut in two between inside and outside. We went back to Arab, and we overlaid the pattern of the structure over the position of the glass facade, and through scratching our heads a bit, we realized that there's a zigzag in there. And it was quite a happy coincidence. I view these things sometimes, because sometimes you just stumble across these things. But what that did was it gave us some structural advantages. In having the zigzag facade, we could reduce the vertical structure in the glass. It also had some solar benefits as well as acoustic benefits. What I quite like about it is the fact that because it's refracted, when you look at the facade, you never see yourself or your immediate background. You see deeper into the building because of that, which helps that connection between inside and outside. And it ended up looking quite beautiful as well, which was a bonus. I don't think, we had the building photograph immediately after it was finished, because as architects, we can't wait to photograph our buildings. But it was a little bit premature, I think, in a way as well, because the landscape still needs to consume the building. It still needs to grow over the structure. But anyway, I guess in about 2 or 3 years, it would reach its maturity. It's also, through photographing it, you realize it's quite a difficult building to photograph, because 80% of it is below ground. And also, you've only got one facade. The best way really to experience a building like this is to go there in person. But obviously that, unless you book a South African safari or you go on a wine tour, which I don't know if you will do as an Italian, it's difficult. So I brought along the second best, which is a video, which was done by Epitome, which explains a bit more about the movement of the building. Thank you very much.